This is chapter 19 of the Speaker's Primer, and we start talking about language. It talks about the characteristics of language. One of the first things that we need to understand about language is that language and its meaning is arbitrary. The words that we use have no real distinct relationship with the things that they represent. We arrange the words DOG. Well, we say, well, that means dog, and then we think about animals running around. Then we rearrange it, that same thing, to God, and well, that means God. And so there's just various arbitrary meanings that we assign to words, and because of that, those meanings can change over time. A few years back, I had a student commenting to another student that apparently LeBron James was really sick last night, and I asked, was he so sick he couldn't play? And they said, oh, no, sick is good now. Well, that was news to me. Another thing about language is language obviously sometimes is ambiguous, and that is why we sometimes have misunderstandings. Language can be abstract. There are ways that we can say things that will not make them clear. It's about language being hierarchical. There's structure and value that orders things along a continuum. About how college is structured, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, creates a hierarchy. So language does have that ability to do that type of thing. There are differences between spoken and written language. It is very important that we understand that spoken language is irreversible. Of course, written language is the same way, in the sense that once you send an email to someone, post it on Facebook, all of these things you may remove it, but that doesn't mean people forget that you did it or that you said it. Spoken language is less formal. I want to go back to irreversible, though. The concept I try to tell students to remember is this. Remember the fact that you cannot unring the bell. Once you've said something to someone, you can't go back to a time where you never said that. I've never called my wife a name. I've never been that type of person. If I ever call my wife a name, I cannot go back to a time where I've never called my wife a name. And that's true of anyone. So remember that. You cannot unring the bell. Chapter 18, going forward to the next section, structuring language. There are ways that we can structure language that makes it more memorable. There's repetition. If you think about the I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King mentioned I have a dream a number of times, from which, of course, it gained its name. Then there's alliteration. And it gives some examples here, but I'd rather go back to the Martin Luther King speech. Alliteration is the same consonant or vowel sound at the beginning of subsequent words. In one of his sentences was, he had a dream that one day his children would live in a country where they were not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's alliteration combined, by the way, with antithesis, where you're combining opposing elements in the same sentence. Parallelism as similarly structured related words or phrases, and that's another thing that Martin Luther King used as well. He talked about we cannot go back, or we cannot wait, and along that line, it's just a very powerful thing when you repeat things, but you repeat them in different ways. It actually adds meaning to it. We talked about antithesis in just a minute. Some other language devices, similes. Similes are, we compare something to something else using the word like or as to take out the like or as, and then we start talking about metaphors. Talks about synecdoche, where you use one part of something to represent the whole thing. And then metonymy is where it involves a tangible object. You use a tangible object to represent an otherwise intangible thing. We talk about someone having heart. Heart. A person has heart and spirit. A heart is a tangible thing, but when you think about the heart that people have, that's not a tangible thing. Archetypal metaphors are metaphors that transcend culture. It's about good and evil, light and darkness, about sunrise and sunset, even something that transcends cultures. Mixed metaphors, you combine two objects that have no logical connection with each other. The saying, someone is a wolf in sheep's clothing, there's no inherent connection between those two, but they do create a picture, don't they? I talked about narratives and stories that we can tell. We oftentimes communicate through the narratives that we tell each other, the stories that we tell each other. Some important guidelines for using language. One is avoid profanity. I don't know what age you may be. One of these days you're going to have children. And I actually talked about this before. I talked about the fact that, you may think I can change my language once I have a child, and you'll find out how hard it is one day. I had a young lady, right after I said this, he threw her hand up in the air. And I said, sure. She said, well, I just had to deal with my 2-year-old saying the F word. Is that what we want? Do we want a world in which 2-year-olds are using the F word? You got to be careful about profanity, because again, you can say it in an awkward situation. Avoid hate speech. Avoid hate speech in your personal life. Really, here's the reality check for you. Every person that you ever meet knows whether you respect them or not. And it's not just in whether you use hate speech. They just know whether you respect them or not. And hopefully you do. But if you don't, and you think that you can trick someone into thinking that you do, you cannot do that. Everyone knows whether you respect them or not. Everyone knows whether you look down on them or not. But avoid hate speech. Do not overuse metaphors. You use vivid language when telling a story. That's the case for where you want concrete words and not abstract words. You want to use language with which you are familiar and the audience is familiar. Very important thing to do is use inclusive language. In a sermon or a sermonette in church, when the pastor or the speaker says you need to do this and you need to do that, that's a little bit, that can be off-putting after a while, and you can the audience can begin to think that they're being spoken down to some degree or corrected. When we use we language, we need to do this, we need to do that. It's really less corrective, and it's also more encouraging in that we're all in the same boat together. We're working on this together, not I'm being told this is what I need to do, as in you, I. So something to be aware of. Use active voice. It's more powerful. Try to avoid wordiness. Don't just have phrases in there that clutter up things and can take away from actually the power of what it is you have to say. It's good to adapt your language to your audience to an extent. You don't want to change your language in a way where it sounds like you're patronizing the audience or trying to fit in with the audience's language, which may not be your language. So be careful about that. But that's chapter 19 of the Speaker